Leonard, an arrogant millionaire, decides to humiliate a quiet waitress by challenging her to perform in front of an upscale restaurant crowd. What begins as a game of ego and power takes an unexpected turn when she accepts the challenge and leaves everyone, including Leonard, speechless. This is a story of unexpected triumph, shattered egos, and the undeniable power of raw talent. It was a warm Friday evening, and the air at La Fontaine, a sophisticated restaurant nestled in the heart of Raleigh, North Carolina, was filled with the soft hum of conversations. The delicate clinking of glasses, the steady footsteps of servers, and the faint strains of jazz emanating from the corner piano created an atmosphere of refined indulgence. Deborah, a 25-year-old waitress with a quiet demeanor but a spark in her eyes, moved gracefully between tables, balancing plates and polite smiles. To most of the guests, she was just another face in uniform. But beneath her calm exterior, Deborah carried dreams far grander than the luxurious dining room that surrounded her. Her true passion wasn't waiting tables, it was music. From a young age, the piano had been Deborah's sanctuary, a place where she could pour out her emotions and tell her story without words. But dreams don't pay the bills. Working long shifts at La Fontaine was a necessary step as she saved for her ultimate goal, attending the prestigious music academy she had always yearned for. Few people knew of her talent, save for her colleagues, who occasionally found her stealing moments at the old, upright piano in the back room during her breaks. That evening, as the dinner rush began to settle, the door to the restaurant swung open, and in walked Leonard Grayson. Instantly recognizable, the wealthy entrepreneur carried himself like he owned the room, his sharp suit and polished companions only adding to his air of superiority. Leonard was notorious for his sharp tongue and his penchant for turning any moment into a spectacle. Even the seasoned staff stood a little straighter when he walked in. Deborah noticed the exchange of knowing glances among her colleagues. Leonard wasn't an easy guest, but for her, he was just another table in a long night's work, or so she thought. As Leonard scanned the room, his eyes landed on Deborah. Something about her caught his attention, and a sly smirk crept across his face. Deborah felt the weight of his stare but brushed it off, focusing on refilling glasses and clearing plates. However, Leonard wasn't done with her. He had already decided she would be the centerpiece of his evening's entertainment. Deborah's upbringing in a small South Carolina town was humble. Her mother, a single parent and tireless nurse, worked long hours to ensure the family was provided for. Despite their modest means, music had always been a constant in their lives. An out-of-tune piano, gifted by a neighbor, became Deborah's escape. While other children played outside, she spent hours teaching herself to mimic songs from the radio and tackling classical pieces from secondhand music books. Her talent didn't go unnoticed. Deborah played at church, school recitals, and community events, but financial hardships overshadowed her dreams of a professional music career. By 18, she realized those dreams would have to wait. Family responsibilities and the absence of scholarships left her with no choice but to set aside her ambitions. Still, the piano remained an essential part of her identity, a quiet promise that someday she would return to it. When Deborah moved to Raleigh, she chose to work at La Fontaine, not just for the pay, but because of the grand piano that graced the restaurant's corner. Though she rarely had time to play, the piano's presence was a source of comfort, a reminder that her dreams were merely on hold. That evening, as Leonard and his entourage settled into their seats, Deborah approached their table with practiced grace, carrying a tray with the ease of experience. Leonard ordered a top-shelf scotch and cracked a loud joke, drawing laughter from his companions and curious glances from nearby diners. Deborah, unfazed, offered a polite smile as she took their orders. "Deborah, huh?" Leonard said, glancing at her name tag with an exaggerated drawl. "Sounds like someone with hidden talents." The comment caught her off guard, but she nodded politely and walked away, unaware of the scheming grin Leonard exchanged with his companions. His gaze followed her as she moved between tables, And though Deborah tried to ignore the strange energy, she couldn't shake the unease he stirred in her. The night continued, the restaurant buzzing with laughter and the clatter of silverware. Leonard held court at his table, boasting loudly about his achievements and throwing subtle jabs about people who lacked ambition. His entourage laughed obligingly, while other diners exchanged annoyed looks. As Deborah returned to their table with a bottle of wine, Leonard caught her off guard again. "Tell me, Deborah," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "What do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely, a young woman like you has dreams." His words stopped her in her tracks. Deborah hesitated, her mind racing for a response, unaware that she was about to be thrust into the spotlight in a way she never anticipated. Leonard wasn't just making conversation. He had something planned, and Deborah was about to find herself at the center of a moment that would leave the entire room speechless. Deborah hesitated, her voice soft. "I play piano sometimes," hoping to end the conversation quickly. Leonard's eyes lit up, and a sly smile crept across his lips. "A pianist, huh? How fascinating. Why don't you give us a little performance?" The room seemed to hush, Leonard's words hanging in the air. Deborah froze, the heat of his challenge pressing down on her. "Oh, I couldn't," she said quickly, forcing a nervous laugh. "I'm just here to work tonight." "Nonsense," Leonard declared, his voice booming with authority. "There's a piano right there in the corner. Show us what you've got. Surely, a future star like you isn't afraid of a little audience." Laughter rippled through his table, his companions clearly enjoying the spectacle. Around them, other diners turned their heads, curious about the commotion. Deborah felt her chest tighten as her gaze darted around the room. She could feel the weight of their stares, the silent judgment ready to unfold. She wanted to walk away, to refuse outright, but Leonard's words lingered in the air, daring her to rise to the challenge or crumble under its weight. "I really shouldn't," she stammered, her voice unsteady as she glanced toward her colleagues for help. But no one intervened, the tension thick in the air. Leonard leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of scotch with a smug expression. "Ah, I see," he said mockingly, his tone dripping with condescension. "All talk, no talent. That's disappointing." His words hit like a slap, stoking a fire inside her. Deborah's hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't one to seek confrontation, but Leonard's blatant dismissal, his attempt to reduce her to a joke, cut deeper than she expected. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a familiar mantra. "Never let anyone make you small, Deborah. You're bigger than they'll ever know." The silence stretched as Deborah glanced toward the piano, then back at Leonard. His smug expression dared her, as if he'd already decided she would back down. Against her better judgment, she made her decision. "Fine," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I'll play." A murmur swept through the room, and the anticipation thickened as Deborah made her way to the grand piano. Each step felt heavy, the weight of fear and defiance intertwining. The chandelier's glow cast a spotlight on her as she approached the polished instrument, isolating her from the murmuring crowd. Sliding onto the bench, Deborah's trembling fingers hovered above the gleaming keys. Behind her, Leonard reclined in his chair, his expression a mix of satisfaction and expectation, as though he'd already won whatever game he thought they were playing. Deborah closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a steadying breath. Her heart pounded so loudly it threatened to drown out her thoughts. This wasn't a school recital or a community event. This was different. This was hostile. But there was no turning back. Her fingers found their place on the keys, and she began to play. The first notes were soft and tentative, the melody almost fragile. A few diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and someone coughed in the back. Deborah blocked them out, focusing on the music. She chose a piece she knew by heart, a soulful rendition of Clair de Lune by Debussy. As the melody unfolded, it wove through the air like a delicate thread, quiet but unwavering. With each passing moment, her confidence grew, and the music swelled. Her hands moved with practiced grace, the notes pouring out like a confession. each chord carrying a piece of her story. The sacrifices her mother made, the nights spent practicing on a beaten piano, the weight of deferred dreams, all of it was there in the music. The diners fell silent, their earlier chatter replaced by a collective stillness. Even Leonard, who had been whispering to his companions, grew quiet. Deborah didn't need to look to feel the shift in the room. The mocking energy had evaporated, replaced by something unfamiliar. Perhaps awe, perhaps humility. The music soared as Deborah lost herself in it. For the first time in years, she wasn't a waitress or a struggling dreamer. She was an artist. Her fingers danced across the keys, drawing raw and vivid emotions that hung in the air like smoke. By the time she struck the final chord, the room was utterly still, the resonance of the piano lingering. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if broken from a spell, the room erupted into applause. The sound was thunderous, filling the space with a warmth Deborah hadn't anticipated. Some diners rose to their feet, clapping with fervor, and her colleagues joined in, their faces alight with pride. Leonard, however, remained seated. His smirk had vanished, replaced by an expression Deborah couldn't quite decipher. Shock? Discomfort? Perhaps both. He raised his hands and offered a slow, hollow clap, but even his reluctant applause couldn't overshadow what had just happened. Deborah stood, her legs trembling but her back straight. She glanced around, seeing the diners not as spectators, but as witnesses. Their expressions carried something new: admiration, respect, even awe. She allowed herself a faint smile, not out of pride, but relief. She hadn't let fear silence her. Finally, her gaze landed on Leonard. He sat with his hands clasped in front of him, his confidence shaken. The smirk he wore so confidently earlier was gone, replaced by forced neutrality. "Well," Leonard said, breaking the silence, his voice louder than necessary, "that was unexpected." His laugh was hollow, lacking its usual bite. Deborah didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already spoken the loudest, with her music. Leonard leaned back in his chair, attempting to reclaim his bravado. "I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places," he said, his comment landing with a dull thud. His companions exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. Deborah tilted her head slightly, studying him. His words were meant to serve as an olive branch, but they felt hollow, weighed down by his inability to truly acknowledge the moment. "Thank you," she replied, her tone steady and deliberate. There was no warmth in her voice, but there was no hostility either. Deborah wasn't about to let Leonard pull her back into the smallness he had tried to impose on her. Her performance had already spoken louder than any rebuttal she could offer. Leonard cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable under the weight of the room's collective gaze. He gestured for the waiter, ordering another drink in a flimsy attempt to mask his unease. "You've got quite a gift," he added reluctantly, as though the words themselves were a burden. Deborah met his eyes with quiet confidence. "Everyone has a gift," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." The weight of her words rippled through the air, subtle but unmissable. They weren't loud or confrontational, but their impact was undeniable. The room seemed to hold its breath, the power of her statement settling over the diners like a soft wave. Leonard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual air of dominance slipping further with each passing second. Around the room, diners began to return to their meals, though the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. What had once been a quiet hum of privilege and pretense was now something richer, a shared sense of understanding, even respect for the waitress who had reminded everyone of the strength of authenticity. Leonard wasn't just humiliated, he was exposed. The charm and bravado he had relied on couldn't shield him from the truth. Everyone in the room had seen it. His power to belittle others had been stripped away, leaving only the vulnerability he so desperately tried to conceal. Deborah stepped away from the piano, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. Her colleagues greeted her with quiet smiles and subtle nods of encouragement as she returned to her station. She still had a job to finish, but something about her had shifted. Her head was held a little higher, her movements more deliberate. Leonard's table had fallen silent. The companions who had laughed at Deborah's expense earlier now avoided eye contact, their conversation reduced to murmurs. The bravado that had dominated their corner of the restaurant had dissolved, leaving only an awkward quiet in its place. The evening carried on, but Deborah felt lighter. Every step she took through the dining room was purposeful, her confidence blooming in a way she hadn't anticipated. As she refilled glasses and cleared plates, diners stopped her to offer kind words. "You're incredible," an older woman said softly as Deborah set down a coffee cup. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving." "Keep going," another man added. "You've got something special. Don't let anyone take that from you." Deborah thanked them with quiet humility, her heart swelling with gratitude. These weren't just compliments. They were validations of everything she had worked for, everything she had dreamed of. She had reminded them of the power of perseverance and authenticity. And perhaps most importantly, she had reminded herself. Deborah had worked for everything she had ever dreamed of, and in that moment, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Leonard, however, was not nearly as gracious. As Deborah approached his table to deliver the check, he looked up at her with a conflicted expression, a mix of annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he said, his tone clipped. "No need to rub it in." Deborah paused, meeting his gaze directly. Her calm, steady voice cut through the tension. "It was never about proving anything to you," she replied. "I just wanted to play." Leonard had no response. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, fidgeting with his drink. The man who had commanded attention all evening now sat awkwardly, his once dominant presence reduced to a mere shuffle. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and everyone at the table could feel it. As Leonard scribbled his signature on the check, one of his companions, a younger man with a softer demeanor, looked up at Deborah. "You were amazing," he said, his voice sincere. "Truly." The genuine kindness in his words caught Deborah off guard. For a fleeting moment, she saw a glimmer of humanity in a group she had written off as shallow. "Thank you," she said, offering him a small but heartfelt smile, before turning and walking away. The evening came to a quiet close. Leonard and his entourage left without their usual flair, slipping out of the restaurant in an uncharacteristically subdued manner. Deborah watched them leave, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness. Leonard was no longer on her mind. Instead, her thoughts were on the future, on the next step she needed to take. The tips that night were unusually generous, enough to cover her rent and set aside a little extra for the piano lessons she had been putting off for months. As she locked up the restaurant and walked home, the crisp night air filled her lungs, and for the first time in years, she felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a dreamer. She was an artist. And nothing, not mocking words, financial struggles, or even her own fears, could take that away. Back in her small apartment, Deborah sat down on the worn bench of her old upright piano. The sound wasn't as rich as the grand piano at the restaurant, but it didn't matter. As her fingers glided over the keys, the music flowed freely from her heart, just as it always had. That night wasn't about triumph or validation. It was about realization. Her talent wasn't something she needed to justify or hide. It was hers, and it was enough. In the days that followed, the story of her performance at the restaurant began to spread. Patrons who had witnessed the moment shared it with others, and soon it became something of a local tale. A few days later, Deborah received an unexpected call. On the other end was a music producer who had been dining at the restaurant that night. He wasn't offering fame or fortune, but he extended an opportunity to record a demo. It wasn't a guarantee of success, but it was a door opening, and Deborah wasn't afraid to walk through it. For years, fear and doubt had whispered lies into her mind, convincing her that she wasn't enough, that her dreams were too big. But now, she saw the truth. Her resilience and authenticity were her greatest strengths. The night with Leonard Grayson wasn't just a fleeting victory. It was a reminder that integrity and self-belief are more powerful than any ridicule or belittlement. Leonard, with all his wealth and bravado, had nothing that could diminish her. He represented every voice of doubt she had ever faced, and she had silenced him, not with anger or confrontation, but with the purity of her craft. To anyone who heard Deborah's story, the message was clear. Never let someone else define your worth. The world is full of people like Leonard Grayson, individuals who project their insecurities onto others to feel powerful. But true strength comes from staying rooted in who you are and letting your passions speak louder than their ridicule. As Deborah closed the piano lid that night and rested her hands on the faded wood, a quiet smile spread across her face. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like it had truly begun. What about you? What dream have you been holding back because of fear or doubt? Don't wait for someone like Leonard to test you. Take your step forward now. If Deborah's story inspired you, subscribe for more tales of resilience and triumph. Who knows? Your story might be the next one we share.